Imagine a world where more women had the time to fully explore their genius. Welcome to She Rebel Radio, the UK's podcast for women ready to explore their genius. We've been celebrated for counter-status quo ideas and a whole dose of feminine perspective. Please note, this episode comes with a trauma warning as we discuss domestic violence, family trauma and healing, as well as the death penalty. So please take care whilst listening. Welcome to episode 154 of She Rebel Radio. Ruth Ellis, Murder, Misogyny and Morality, with her granddaughter, Laura Enston. In July 1955, Ruth Ellis became the last woman to be executed in the UK. She was just 28 years old. Following a 2-day trial, the young mother of two is convicted of the premeditated murder of her boyfriend, David Blakely. To many, she became the jealous lover, social climber and a cold-blooded killer, immortalised as a woman defined by one single act. But over the decades, a different picture has emerged. Evidence of domestic abuse, coercive control and trauma has prompted many to question not only Ruth's sentence and conviction, but whether she was judged for far more than the crime itself. Perhaps her ambition, independence, class, and even her morality. In 2026, more than 70 years after her execution, Ruth Ellis was finally granted a conditional pardon, recognising the historic injustice surrounding her sentence and the way domestic abuse was and is still misunderstood. Some have questioned why we should revisit the past when many women face injustice today in an already struggling and overloaded criminal justice system. But if we fail to learn the lessons of history, surely we risk repeating the same mistakes. Today, I'm joined by Ruth's granddaughter, Laura Enston, as we explore the impact of her grandmother's story on her own life, the misogyny and judgment Ruth faced, and how her legacy today continues to impact women's lives. Laura, it's such a pleasure to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for being here. And I know that you grew up knowing very little about your grandmother's life. What did you know as a child about her, and how did that shape you growing up?
So my introduction to Ruth's story came through a film, which was, I think, made in 1985, and it was rated 15, and it was a movie ultimately about Ruth's life, Dance with a Stranger, great cast, very, I think it was quite critically acclaimed at the time, but ultimately, it was too old for young eyes, and I was sort of at the age of 7 made to watch this film by my mum. And ultimately that was sort of, I think, my introduction and also the starting point of me distancing myself from it. It was very violent, there was a lot going on, and I just was quite confused and quite traumatized by what I was watching, and knew at that point I didn't want anything to do with it. And ultimately I think that started like my sort of living, it became a secret. I didn't distance myself from the story. I didn't really want to be a part of it, and I ended up, living with a secret. And it was quite difficult when I was at school because my mum, everyone knew my mum. My mum was sort of she very much leaned in on Ruth's story, and she was very well known. She did a lot of television back in the 90s, and was in the papers a lot. And it was quite difficult at that age for me to sort of distance myself from her. But as I grew older and we had different surnames, that helped. And I sort of obviously left school, went into the workplace, it became a lot easier. So when I sort of changed tact and started leaning on this story off the back of the drama that was broadcast last year, I had to go around and talk to people I've known maybe 30 years to say,
Wow.
I know we've been friends a long time, but surprise, I've got this little thing that's going on. So yeah, it ultimately, it's funny because someone said to me as a child, don't let it define you. And ultimately, what I grew up believing Ruth to be was this fictitious character that had been really sort of created to justify her execution. You know, that she was this cold-blooded killer, social climber, you know, that she sort of chose bad men over her kids and all this sort of stuff, and that, you know, her morals were questioned. You know, ultimately she worked at, you know, she was a manageress of a nightclub in London, and you know, her morality was very much questioned, and you know, the type of work that she did, and you know, she didn't really conform to the good little housewife persona that the government were really trying to push at the time. And you know, I sort of grew up believing this, that Ruth was
Yeah.
this quite sordid character, cold-blooded character. And you know, as a teenage girl, I didn't want any association with that sort of those sorts of themes. And I was really petrified of being tarnished with the same brush. And I felt like I grew up with a little bit of a target on my back, to be honest. You know, I'm looking at how, you know, my mother was treated in the 90s, and you know, by the media. You know, she was really sort of chewed up and spat out. And you know, I was really petrified of giving anyone any evidence that I could be like my mum or Ruth. So
Mm.
you know, I really led a quite it all became quite secretive and unnecessarily, really. And I think I grew up with this sort of really heavy burden of shame and embarrassment.
Yeah, and it sounds like you carved a separate
I
identity,
did,
you know,
yeah,
for yourself.
very much so, very much so. You know, I really, you know, kept my head down at school. You know, studied hard, worked hard, but ultimately, I think it has totally carried with me. You know, I suppose, you know, in my quest to not be defined by it, I ended up being defined by it, but
Mm.
in a completely opposite way to how my mum was defined, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's so important. A message of our whatever happens in our families, you know, we can either accept or reject it, but we end up carrying it in some way, shape, or form by our response. And is it you understood when you watched the film when you were 7? Did you say that this was a depiction of your grandmother
Mm.
and her case and what happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's how my mum positioned it. So she sat me, my younger brother and sister down. So we were ages sort of 5, 6, and 7 to
Yeah.
watch it. Watch. I mean, I'm laughing because it's just so bonkers when I sort of talk about it now. But you know, I think it's a
It was
real
a very
insight.
different time in the 80s.
It was. It certainly was. But also, I think it's a good insight into where my mother's head was at.
Yeah.
You know, and this is sort of I've gone through a period of really sort of thinking about her behavior. You know, I grew up feeling incredibly frustrated and let down by her. You know, I looked at this woman who had so much opportunity from my point of view. You know, she was incredibly beautiful, very charismatic. You know, she had some very high profile boyfriends who went out, George Best, Richard Harris. In my mind, she had it all. And then she sort of, it, as growing up, I thought, why do you choose to act like you do? Why do you choose to make these decisions and end up on the front pages of newspapers? And you know,
Mm.
she was interviewed by Michael Barrymore in the 90s, which, you know, unfortunately still on YouTube. But it's a, you know, she was drunk on a primetime television,
Yeah.
you know, interview. You know, and I just used to think, well, you know, you choose to act like this. Why do you choose? But then I realize now through a modern day lens, actually, you know, she didn't have the tools. You know, she was so traumatized by what she'd been through. And yeah,
Yeah.
yes, she was
She
only
was only 3, wasn't she, in
yeah, she was only
1955?
3, but I think, and obviously by this point, by the time Ruth was executed, she was already living with another family.
Yeah.
And she didn't find out until her, you know, later in her childhood, when she came across some newspaper cuttings and she sort of put two and two together. But I think what that must have done to her growing up, knowing that her mother's life wasn't worth saving, you know, what that must do to you mentally, you know, and then
Yeah,
that
that's
what how
huge.
that impacts your self-worth, your confidence. And I think that's very much a theme that I feel like has cascaded down, you know, to me. And you know, I'm so hell bent on breaking the cycle, because I think, you know, if your confidence is undermined, you know, I think it really impacts you professionally and personally. And I think your boundaries are blurred. You know, you put up with behavior that, you know, you really shouldn't be putting up with, because your self-worth is questioned. And
Yeah.
You get your. I always got my self-worth from other sources because I didn't feel worthy as a human,
Mm.
and it's sort of, I really realize now how much that carried with me. And I think, skipping back to Ruth, I think you look at the abuse she suffered, and obviously that started at home. Her father was abusive, her first husband was abusive, and I think her confidence will have been eroded. Her confidence would have been, non-existent, and the same with her self-worth, which is why she ended up in these tolerating, men with acting the way they did towards her.
Yeah, yeah, and we'll talk about it a bit further down, and and I of how much I know is accurate and what's not in terms of her. And I know that there were other people fighting for her reprieve, which was very common for women at that time, but her struggling to do that herself as well, and how men were so easily able to define women's worth and lives at that time, and arguably still today. And how we're so judged. And I think what's really interesting, my understanding is, and we're so much more trauma aware and informed, I think
Mm.
even since, and I think it was in 2020 that you came across A Fine Day for a Hanging by Carol Ann Lee. I find it interesting that she's a female author, which really revealed the extent of physical, sexual, emotional, and financial abuse your grandmother received throughout her lifetime at the hands of many men, if not every man that she
Mm.
encountered. And how did that, and we've already touched upon it, but how did learning, the reality of what she experienced change your
It
understanding of you and your family history, and for women in general?
it was a real turning point, and if I'm honest, I didn't want to read it. And it was my younger brother who got in touch with me and said, I think he got in touch with me and told me when it had been published. I think that was around 2014. He said,
Yeah,
you got to read
well,
this
yeah, I think it was
book.
2012. I looked.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Yeah, he got in touch with me and said, you got to read this book. You got to read this book. And I said, Steve, I'm not interested. I
Mhm.
felt like when Mum died in 2001, almost Ruth died again with her, because the story went to bed, and there was nobody else. On my side of the family, I know Ruth's sister Muriel was campaigning at that point for she was taking the case back into the Court of Appeal. But from my side, I felt like when Mum died, Ruth died again with her, and I didn't want to bring the story back up. I wasn't interested in being part of that narrative. And
Yeah.
when he messaged me and said, I need you to read this book, and I said, I don't want to. He said, you have to, because ITV are doing a drama on it and they want to talk to you.
Oh,
And at
wow.
that point, my sort of eyes rolled, and I thought, oh God, here we go again. Please make it stop. Why? And he said, look, go and read the book. So that's what I did. I went off and read the book, and it was just jaw dropping what I was reading. And obviously, I was incredibly grateful for the book. Is the level of research and detail that Carol put into that, I just found absolutely amazing. And I think I learned more about my family history in that book than I've learned in 40 something years of being a human being. And I was just really blown away by what I was reading. And what was great about it as well was that, yes, it sort of really shone a spotlight on what Ruth had endured in terms of, like, say, the extent of the abuse that she suffered, really at the hands of every significant man that had been in her life. But also it provided, the full extent of how she'd been let down by the system,
Yeah.
and also the social context of the time. Ultimately, what she was up against. She was. What I realised was that she was on trial for so much more than just murder. It was classism. She was a working class girl. She killed an upper class man. She killed one of their own, effectively.
Yeah.
Um, there was obviously the misogyny, the minimization of her trauma, her abuse. There was extensive medical records there evidencing the brutality she'd faced. She had
Mhm.
had a number of hospital visits, various people, various witnesses who saw her black and blue. Um, there was just so much there, that it just, for the first time, I felt like I had a true understanding of the full picture of
Mhm.
what had gone on with this case.
Well, yeah, and how often it is, and as you know, I used to be in criminal defence, and come from criminology background and lecture some criminology now, is how across the board, it's not just in criminal justice, but in criminal justice, everything's magnified tenfold, that there is no space or understanding for women's experience because it's such a male dominated environment to be in. And even the laws that are created. And I know that in your grandmother's case, they try to rely on provocation, which is a sudden loss of control. If a man has lost his honor, which really, and I know Harriet Wistrich, a feminist lawyer, has talked about this. That's enabling men, really a defense for men, rather than a woman's experience of where she's in fear after years and years of abuse. And because men were making laws at the time, and it was playing out in courtrooms, it's trying to squeeze a defense that just doesn't fit a woman's experience in any way, shape or form.
That's it. And I think as well, ultimately Ruth represented change. When you talk about Ruth, if you were just, she, for all intents and purposes, you could be describing a modern day woman. She was a single mum living in London. She was working as a nightclub manager. She was ultimately, in the face of adversity, she had achieved so much. The club that she was running, she'd started it from scratch, and it was thriving. It was a real hot spot, and she was earning incredibly well. And she just was a very, like I say, a modern day woman, but living in a time when people didn't understand, like I say, the extent and the impact, the mental impact of long-term domestic abuse on the human mind. But ultimately, as well, she represented change, and the justice system just wasn't set up to deal with people like Ruth. And
No.
It's like this massive juggernaut, isn't it, that just takes years to catch up with modern society. And at the time, it was post-war Britain. Women were being thanked for their war efforts, and being encouraged to head back home to be a good little housewife. And really, Ruth was the antithesis of this. And I think ultimately 90% of women were reprieved in the 20th century, but ultimately Ruth just represented, I think there was a lot of fear about what Ruth represented.
Yeah, a woman
And
making her own choices, attempting to make
precisely,
her own
yeah.
choices, and being put. And it really I've done quite a lot of research over the past year for various reasons of miscarriages justice of women cases. And I don't know if you know anything about Edith Thompson, who is
I know a
executed in.
little bit. Yes, I do know a
Yeah,
bit about that
and
case.
there are definitely some parallels. Whilst there's a small indication of some domestic abuse from her husband, but more again, being a woman who was working, earning more money than her father and her husband, and had ambition, and had two men at the same time, one of which was younger, which wouldn't have gone down well at that time. And that was after the First World War. And again, she was one of that, there only been 15 women who were executed in the 20th century, where her reprieve wasn't granted either.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a case actually the same month that Ruth was executed, of a woman in strange ways in Manchester who was reprieved, and she battered her next door neighbour with a spade. But
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, it was a working class woman killing a working class woman. And I
Yeah,
suspect that this, she was married. She was, she ultimately conformed to, societal conventions at the time, and and she was reprieved. So it just shows how biased and how much was going on there. There was just so many more layers, such a complex case, which is why we're
yeah,
still talking about it today.
yeah, and understanding how would women explain at during a trial, things like miscarriage and domestic violence, when they didn't have the language for it, and how that would be digested by I don't know if your grandmother's jury, certainly in the ITV dramatization of the book A Fine Day, I think they were all men and one woman.
Yeah, I think it was 10 men and 2 women, I think. But yeah, it was a
Yeah,
majority were men.
yeah. And having sexual relations outside of marriage, and all of
Mm,
those things were not palatable and acceptable at that time. So being tried for morality, and in Edith Thompson's case tried for adultery,
mm.
as well, or all factors that women, are really judged on. Do you
And I
still
think
think?
there was, oh, sorry, I was just going to say that, just make a point that there wasn't also a bit of a movement towards the abolition of the death penalty as well. And I think ultimately the government, wanted to appear tough on crime, and that was sort of another element that was at play in the decision making process.
Yeah, and it's so frequently politics, is tied into criminal decisions even today. The amount of politicians that come in to be tough on crime and to take action, and all of those things is very prevalent. So 70 years on, I think it was 71 years, finally receiving the conditional pardon, which I believe you were central in campaigning for. What has that recognition meant to you personally and to your family? How did it come about? And my understanding is you used some of those medical records that were sitting there to
Yes.
make this happen.
Yeah, so off the back of the drama, broadcast last year, we were approached by Mishkondareya. So ultimately, they have a connection to Ruth's story. So Victor Mishkon was Ruth's divorce lawyer, and
Um,
she brought him in about 48 hours before she was due to hang,
mhm.
to help with a last minute reprieve. Unfortunately, it was a little bit too late, and he wasn't able to get that reprieve. But ultimately, the case really sat with him, and he was upset that he wasn't able to get a positive result for Ruth. And basically, what happened was his firm came to us and basically said, look, we want to finish what Victor started, and that's sort of where it all kicked off ultimately. So the process we went through was that we put an application in to the Justice Secretary, which included a lengthy document, but also about 800 pages of supporting evidence, which included all her medical records that were in the National Archives. It included scripts, it included transcripts, photographs, various different pieces of evidence. A lot of it, was available at the time.
Yeah.
And we
What
put,
were there photographs of injuries and
yeah, there've
yeah.
been, there are definitely photos circulating around online of Ruth with bruises, but there was also witness statements where friends had seen her black and blue. There was all sorts in there. It was just a real treasure trove of information. But we packaged that up and submitted this application for a conditional pardon. So ultimately, it doesn't go after the conviction. It's ultimately questioning that she should not have been hung for the
Yeah.
crime. So basically, the application went in October last year, and we had a phone call to say, yeah, it's happening. We are going to be announcing Ruth's pardon in the Prime Minister's questions on the 8th of July, and it was a very, very surreal, just incredible moment, really. And I think I was able to go into the House of Commons to actually hear the news being delivered by David Lammy, and I think to have it delivered in that sort of way really brought it home how historic that moment was.
Yeah.
And to hear it in person, I think just really brought it home how important this was. And as I came out of the public gallery, there were women who had been in the public gallery too, and they were crying, coming up to me saying how happy they were, how pleased they were that Ruth had finally got this pardon. And that's what I found really fascinating over the last few months is the amount of women who have approached me who have been impacted by domestic abuse in some shape or form. Their stories will never get retold, but we had the opportunity to retell Ruth's, and that's something that they've been really passionate and supportive of. And the messages I've had since has just been incredible. I've done media interviews with from all over the world. I've done Canada, Spain, Germany. I've had messages from New Zealand. I've just had people all over the world, watching this case. because I think it's so important. Yes, this was 70 years ago. It's not going to bring Ruth back to life. It's not going to bring my mother back to life, or anyone who's been impacted by the case. However, it sends a message, and I think the government ultimately have got some very big targets to meet in terms of reducing violence towards women and girls. And I think you can only show progress when you admit the mistakes of the past. And I think when we so plainly in black and white
Yeah.
detailed out how badly this case went, they I don't think they had a choice from my point of view. What if they hadn't granted a reprieve? What message would that have sent?
Yeah, yeah, and ultimately, although in the witch trials, which were only 400 years ago, there have been no reprieves or conditional pardons there,
Mm,
as there have in Scotland. Which, funny enough, I've got the women coming on She Rebel Radio to talk about that, and I find that interesting in terms of how women are silenced, and ultimately, your grandmother's sentence was commuted from capital punishment to life imprisonment.
mhm,
And it's, and I resonated actually with the divorce lawyer that took over in the last 48 hours, being so disgraced by the criminal justice system when
mm,
as someone who's not in it on a day-to-day basis, because the trauma runs through. And I used to have that other lawyers from different areas going, as if this happens in the criminal justice system, you're like, yeah, kind of, these kind of things
mm,
happen because there's so much trauma being processed through that system, and God knows how long of not understanding it. And yeah, it's the other thing I was going to say was your grandmother's story is so many women's stories, and so many women's stories who it just ends in a different way, maybe by
mm.
their loss of life from a violent partner.
Absolutely. I think it's just been a really incredible journey. And I think, people say to me sort of, why now? I think we are only starting to understand the impact, aren't we, in terms of that trauma, what that does on the human mind. And I think, even sort of 5-10 years ago, I don't think we understood. And I think we're starting to scratch that scab of generational trauma, understanding actually the people that we are today, you know, is it is all rooted back to our childhoods. And with Ruth's case, we are still very much feeling that ripple effect, in terms of her two children. So my mother was 3, her Ruth's son Andre, my uncle, was 10. Ultimately their lives were cut short. I've said that, one, I feel like when that death sentence was handed out to Ruth, the clock was also started on my mother's life, and her brother's too.
Yeah.
How could those children actually grow up to be properly functioning adults? It's beyond me, really. It's quite, you think about it, there was no therapy, no
No.
support given to them. They were just sort of left to go off into the world and figure stuff out. And
Yeah,
my
not even
uncle,
talked about, as you said, your
no,
mother
that's
kind of had
it.
to find out. It
Exactly,
wasn't something that was
exactly.
explained to her.
No, not at all. And my mother just led a life of chaos. She was a really restless soul. And I think ultimately she just really struggled to understand who she was, and what being Ruth's daughter actually meant. And she led just she was all over the place, and she ended up not looking after herself, and drinking too much, and she got cancer and died at the age of 50. My uncle had lots of mental health issues, developed schizophrenia, and committed suicide at the age of 37. I think it's just, and then obviously we've feeling the impact of that today. My mother had 6 children. Her childbearing years span 20 years. We all have quite a different experience of Ruth, of mum,
Mm.
and are all at very different stages of our sort of healing journey. And the ripple effects are still being felt today.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And as you said, with the family law firm, also, being impacted in a much more minor way than you as a family, but still wanting this to be resolved in the right way that it should have been.
That's it. I
Um,
think as well, it's not just the family that have been impacted. It was everybody who touched this case was
yeah,
impacted in some way, to the point where, one of the prosecution team paid for my uncle's funeral. the judge sent my uncle money every year. I think they all felt like they had blood on their hands.
Yeah, yeah, and I know the judge was the great grandfather of Nigel Havers, the actor who was in Cruel Love, the ITV adaptation, and again, it sat with the family, and I think the judge fought for her reprieve, but wasn't able to make the legal directions because the case didn't fit into the law as it stood at the time because it's male led and a male
That's it.
dominated
That's
system.
it. And I think that was the reasons why. Obviously, my Ruth's sister Muriel took the case into the Court of Appeal. I think it was in 2003,
Yeah,
and ultimately it was thrown out. And knowing what I know now about that process, I understand why, because ultimately they could only look at whether the law at the time had been misapplied, and
yeah,
it hadn't been in
yeah.
reality.
Yeah, and the law
It,
can't be retrospective
no,
looking backwards, but that causes real
no, of
problems when we
course it does.
evolve as humans.
Of course it does it. And what makes this different is this approach that we did. And ultimately there was no costs, from a sort of taxpayer point of view. It didn't have to go back into court. It didn't,
Yeah,
ultimately it was just someone in the MOJ reading the document and obviously getting some advice. But it was this process allowed it's different in that it allows the Justice Secretary to look at societal developments, changing attitudes, changes in the law, and look at whether historic crimes were dealt with properly. And like I say, we're very fortunate that that sentence has now been changed. And I think for me, it just gives some peace. So it, the the pardon news was announced just before the anniversary of Ruth's execution, and it was the first time that I felt just quite calm. And I think it gives the family, for the first time, actually permission to think what life could have been like if Ruth had been reprieved.
yeah,
Ultimately, I don't try and she wasn't a saint. She still killed somebody.
yeah.
But if she had gone to prison, let's say she'd served 30 years, she would have been 58 when she came out.
Mm.
And you put it like that, it's, and I truly believe if she had been reprieved, there's a good chance my mother would still be alive today.
Yeah.
I think we just, it's that ripple effect, you just can't underestimate that mental health impact it had on her two children.
No, no, and the family, we exist as a system to find a resolution to such a tragedy somewhere. And it really struck me as well of two things of, one, that the reprieve happening in, or the conditional pardon in July, in terms of the anniversary, but also,
Mm.
we had the World Cup on in July, and domestic violence was, the police have started to track domestic violence alongside the World Cup tournaments in England, and it was at its highest,
Mm.
which just shows how relevant it is today that domestic abuse is understood, and b, how quickly your grandmother's case was processed, which it was at those times, because now it would take 3 years for something to come to court, for a trial,
Oh,
because it was
that's
less
it.
than 3 months.
Oh, it was wild. The trial just lasted just over a day. The jury took, I think, 23 minutes to find her guilty. She was executed 3 weeks later.
Mm.
When you put it like that, it's wild when you look
Well, and
how
again, what we know about trauma, it can take, it can take 70 years, 100 years, even for a family to process, how Ruth wouldn't have been able to process what had happened to her
that's it. And
in
I
her
think,
life.
yeah, when you look at how she behaved, during her trial, she was very cold, very shut down. Lucy Boynton, who played Ruth in the drama, did an incredible job of really bringing that to life. And ultimately, through a 1955 lens, she looks like this cold-blooded killer. She's not crying, she's not showing any emotion, and she's not sorry for what she did. When you look at that behavior through a modern day lens, this is a woman who's clearly suffering trauma, probably not fit to stand trial.
Yeah. Yeah, and as in the drama, she said a number of times, I feel confused,
Mm.
And we think, how with what she'd been through, and 28 in our generation is so young.
Oh, and it's incredible, really. They were just both so young. It's, incredibly sad.
Yeah, yeah, and I think sometimes when we look at old photos and try and understand things that have happened previously, I don't know if it's being black and white. Everyone just seemed like they were older and more mature than they
Mm,
actually were. And I think experiencing so much at a young age of war and all of those things, not forgetting that she'd been through that as well
exactly, exactly.
as everything that had happened. Um, so within her reprieve, is it also correct that she didn't want to fight that
Yeah, and
that
I
time?
think that's right. Yeah, ultimately, she was protecting somebody. So
Yeah,
there was a third player in this little story, a chap called Desmond Cousin, and his role was completely minimised and not investigated. But what we realise now is that ultimately he was the guy who gave her the gun. He taught her how to shoot, and he dropped her at the scene, knowing that she was very drunk. So he was a very big factor in the story. But what we realise now, thanks to Carol's book, is that he was being protected. He had a cousin in the prosecution team,
yeah,
and he was, even though he was Ruth's friend, he was called as a witness for the prosecution, not for the defence. But again, we realise now that was a strategic move to get him on and off the stand as quickly as possible. But again, none of that was investigated. She told the police that the gun had been given to her as a security for a loan in the club, but this gun, was well oiled and it just didn't sort of fit that. But because they just treated it as a sort of a cut and shut case. There was sort of cut and dry case that she never denied. There was no denying that she'd ever done it. But there was just no appetite to investigate things properly.
no. And again, I feel like that it is misogyny again, in terms of a man with certain connections of a certain class, if he has a family member who's in legal practice at that time, of men protecting men and the boys club. And
That's exactly what was going on here. And also as well, the type of work she did. The club that she was running was frequented by politicians, and it was a really it was a real hot night spot in Knightsbridge in London. And she probably saw too much. She probably knew too many people.
yeah. Yeah, and I think even today, as we've seen with Jeffrey Epstein case and things, which is interesting, is only a woman in prison serving time for that. But how disposable women are, and definitely were within
Exactly.
those kind of environments. So other people, and Christine Keeler, I think there was a connection there at some point. With politicians again, she was the one that was put on the front line, and it gets that press attention and all of that as well. What
That's
kind,
it.
yeah, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I was just going to say there was, looking back at sort of other cases. So I was fortunate enough to connect with David Challen, so Sally Challen's
Yeah,
son, and I was quite shocked at the parallels between Ruth's case and Sally's, in terms of how Sally had been portrayed in the press and how the extent of her domestic abuse was never properly investigated, hence why she ended up in prison. And that was only 2010. And it took her son's near 9 years to get her out.
yeah.
Yes, we've made some progress, but we are still way off.
Well, and I think, when the tables are turned in those kind of cases, and I think if I'm correct, in the Sally Challen case, she was potentially told not to speak ill of the dead,
Correct. Yeah.
if her husband had been killed. Whereas when it's the other way round and a woman's been killed, it's a free for all,
Mm,
as to her character, her morality, and all of those things, which is a really interesting, again, a male dominated system, kind of protecting men in a way that we can't quite see or understand. And women are, it is a free for all. And I certainly feel like a woman as myself, we are judged more generally on all sorts of things, let alone in
mm,
the courtroom.
absolutely. There's just so much at play with this case. It was just been a really fascinating process to go through, and incredibly cathartic as well. And I feel so much lighter as a result of it, that now I know the full story, and ultimately, you know, the my drive has been my two daughters. So I've got an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old, and now we know what we know about Ruth's case. How could I not take this on?
Yeah,
I want to show them that, yes, out of something so terrible, positive, something positive can come. And when I was telling them about the story, I was really quite nervous, because I was a similar age, to when I found out, and I thought, how do I tell two young children, about this? And I remember sitting them down, and I started actually at the very beginning, and luckily they've got quite a good understanding of mental health. And I started with the abuse, obviously in a child appropriate way, but talked about the abuse that Ruth suffered, and at the hands of every significant man,
yeah,
and then gradually built up to the killing, and then her execution. And my girls responded in such an incredible way. I think one of my daughters said, "Well, it sounds like David killed her first," which
yeah,
I thought was incredibly powerful from a child. Um, one of the other girls said to me, "Well, mummy, if the law changed because of Ruth, then it should have been called Ruth's Law." And then
yeah,
another one, went ran upstairs and came down with one of those books, Little People Big Dreams, which are sort of these books that showcase somebody incredible in society, and it's like a children's book.
yeah.
And there was my youngest was like, "Mummy, Ruth needs a book like this." And obviously I went into school to talk to the school about what I was going to be doing, and they've not had a squeak. Not one child said anything to them in the playground.
Mm,
So obviously for me, that's just been incredible, and just shows how far we have come, because unfortunately I grew up, you know with all sorts of playground taunting, and lots of things being said to me and done to me at school as a result of all this.
yeah, and how much more aware young people are, is incredible, and that they,
Mm,
know her story. And I was thinking that, in terms of your grandmother, not only, um, changing the way, and it was another 10 years before the death penalty was abolished, but the human stomach for it, was really impacted by what happened to her. And now this voice for domestic violence, which is an epidemic and a government priority at the moment as well, is, so important. And how many stories. And I was going to mention, I know I did to you an email, and that's why I've always taken an interest in your grandmother's case as well, with my great grandfather being the chaplain of Holloway Prison
mm,
up to 1952, where he died of a heart attack. And he was only in his 50s. And my great aunt, who's still alive today, because he was supporting women who were eventually reprieved. There were no executions in his 3 or 4 years. But he was so deeply impacted by the risk of that happening. She believed that contributed to his poor health. And I've been trying to track some of the women that he supported to find out more of their stories. And I know at least one of them, killed a partner,
wow.
and probably a very similar story. So I definitely want to do some more research around that, as well. And so within your grandmother Ruth, how would you like her to be remembered, and also for the woman that she was? What kind of woman do you think she was? What have you found out about that? So she's not defined by all the terrible things that happened to her.
I always think of her now as a trailblazer. Ultimately, she was a trailblazer in life, and a trailblazer in death. As I've said, as in life, she was just, in the face of adversity, she had achieved so much. And in death, ultimately, her case triggered huge judicial reform in the UK. 2 years later, the Homicide Act came in, that brought in a legal defence of diminished responsibility. um, things changed, and obviously it was the catalyst for the end of the death penalty. So for me, she was just a really quite remarkable woman. Yes, she committed a terrible crime, but when you look at her full context, I really am quite astounded by her, and she's not someone now that I'm shamed or embarrassed by.
No, and she would have had a partial defense to that, in today's world. And absolutely. And I know, as you've talked about, it's been such a healing journey for you, and thank you for sharing it with us. Who are some of the women that have supported you and inspired you along the way, and what comes next for you? And I know you're talking about, that impact on your daughters. And I think, us as women in the past kind of 10 years are really putting together more and more on this stuff, and not accepting this male narrative that can shape our stories and our
Absolutely, yeah. For me,
reality.
it's all been about breaking the cycle. How do I break the cycle of tragic women in my family? And that's sort of something that's been very front and center to my motivations. But in terms of the women, we've been really fortunate. The team at Mishcon de Raya was majority female team, who were so incredibly passionate about. We're all on the same page, incredibly passionate about getting justice for Ruth. The team who produced the drama, again, another all-female team who were just incredible. And I've just felt really protected along the way, if that makes sense. I feel like
Yeah.
I've been with people who are all on the same page, all wanting the same outcome, and I've just been really surrounded by very strong women who are not put off by attitudes and misogyny, and are looking to take it on.
Yeah, yeah, and you can tell, can't you? I watched the ITV drama again over the last couple of days. I watched it when it came out, but it
Mm.
had even more of an impact on me. And yeah, the emotion at the end, and you can tell when it's been created by women.
That's
The
it. I
your
think that was the
story.
difference between the iteration of the film in 1985. Was very it was a male production team, and you could tell.
Yeah.
Ruth, I didn't like Ruth. She was very cold. I don't think many women would have warmed to her, and things
Mhm.
like the domestic violence wasn't introduced until nearly an hour into the movie. There was various issues I had with that film, but the version from ITV, they were just night and day. I really liked Ruth, and I felt that she would be somebody I would know. She would be in my circle, if that made sense. She was
Yeah,
just, it really brought across all facets of her personality, that she had great girlfriends. She was very good at her job. It was just a really full rounded picture of Ruth that I don't think we saw in the other version.
yeah, yeah, and that I haven't seen the other version, and that strength that she showed,
Mm.
but then that can be so misinterpreted as a woman, when it's, as we've already touched upon, that trauma response. But again, I feel as women we're judged for that more, because you should be
Mm.
upset and you should be these things, whereas actually every avenue that she turned into, and she still did very well, and things unraveled in meeting certain men and things like that. But she, yeah, persevered, and
She did.
yeah, it was amazing. But it's been really, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for sharing with us on She Rebel Radio.
Thank you. It's great to chat to you.
Before we go, I wanted to highlight as what's happened in previous generations of our families can impact us in ways that takes years for us to fully understand. So if this episode has brought something up for you, please do get the appropriate support. Thank you for listening to She Rebel Radio. If this episode has inspired you, please pass it on and share with at least one other incredible woman. Don't forget to also hit subscribe and leave us a review. And if you're ready, you can find out more about you and your genius over on my new website, thegeniuswheel.com.